Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of On The Whistle. Unfortunately, another Sunderland defeat to talk about, third in a row. Thanks so much for everyone who's sent questions or comments in. Thank you everyone for watching. I know it's a little bit tough going, to be honest, at the moment following Sunderland, even if it's been a pretty good season on the whole. But yeah, we're going to have a chat about that defeat of Blackburn Rovers. What's going wrong, what happens next, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think my thoughts on the game first and foremost before we go into some of those questions and comments and have a bit of a discussion around those was, I thought there were aspects of the performance, given the context, that were quite good from Sunderland in the sense that I have to say when the team news dropped at 2 o'clock, I was a little bit worried about the game. I did expect Le Bris to make changes. I expect him to rotate. He kind of warned us about that before the game. He'd been very clear that these 2 games and 4 games over the Easter weekend were ones in which he'd make a lot of changes. I think to make 7 changes, to play the number of players that were out of position, and the number of players without a huge amount of championship experience in the team, it felt like a big risk to me because we all know that for understandable reasons, because of the rotation, the results and the performances have dipped, and the mood has dipped a little bit on Weir's side. I think that's more than fair to say. Blackburn Rovers, yes, have had a pretty torrid time of it of late since John Eustace obviously decided to go to Derby County, but they've got some good players and they were in good form coming into this game with 2 wins on the bounce. So I did kind of fear what was going to come next. I worried that there was the potential for a really poor defeat that could really knock the mood on Weir's side even further. Actually, a lot of the performance was quite good from Sunderland in terms of the box-to-box stuff. And I think that in a lot of ways they were really unlucky to lose the game. Blackburn didn't only have 1 shot on target throughout the entire game. But even in the first half, when they were a bit more in the contest, I didn't feel they offered a great deal in attack. I thought there were some Sunderland players who can hold their head quite high after the performance. I thought that Harrison Jones, I said after the Swansea game that I felt that having watched him in the under-21s and what have you in other Sunderland games, he got a bit more to offer than he'd been able to show on that first full league start. And I think you could see that in the first half yesterday. I think he was really, really bright. He was really inventive, played some lovely passes. I think there is still more to come from him. I think they'll get better with time. But I thought it was a really encouraging step forward. I think for Joe Anderson to play out of position at left back, his first full league start for the club, I thought he did pretty well. I thought that generally speaking there were some positives in Sunderland's play in terms of I thought the tempo and the intensity was much better than it had been in that Swansea game. I think the issue really was that they just didn't create anywhere near enough chances. I've just mentioned there that Blackburn only had 1 shot on target, but I think Sunderland only managed 3 or possibly even 2. Which is never going to be enough to win a game of football. And I think that's the issue at the moment. You can understand a little bit that there's a bit of a lack of conviction and confidence in the final third because there's a lot of unfamiliar partnerships. There may be players who haven't really built that confidence in terms of scoring at this level. And so you can understand why maybe it wasn't the most fluid attacking performance in the final third. But I think that that's also a little bit of a worry at the moment because that's a little bit of a recurring theme at the moment. And even when Le Bris made a lot of changes and brought some more familiar players on, some more experienced players on, it didn't make a huge amount of impact, did it? I don't think. I don't really remember the Blackburn goalkeeper having too many saves to make too many clear opportunities. Probably the best one that springs to mind was that lovely cross from Rig that Job just wasn't quite able to get on the end on or certainly make a good enough connection on. It didn't run out for a goal kick. So I think there definitely is a little bit of concern about Sunderland's attacking play. We've spoken about it on this video quite a bit over the last few weeks. Although it was always going to be hard for Easter yesterday in a game where it wasn't going to be loads of service and players around him he's familiar with playing with. I think another game without a goal is definitely a little bit of a concern. He looks a little bit short on confidence to me. So I think there are some worries there. Although having said that, as I said, I thought aspects of the performance were better than I probably anticipated. The big question obviously is what everyone's talking about at the moment is, do these performances matter in terms of the overriding goal, which is to get to the playoff final and hopefully win it. I think that there's a couple of aspects to this from my view is that I've totally understood the rest in rotation policy. I think Sunderland have put too much on too small a group so far this season. I think the opportunity to rest some of those players and try and get some other players up to speed has been quite a valuable exercise in terms of, I think, although I think I gave him 6 out of 10 because it wasn't a kind of a headline performance by any stretch of the imagination, but I think Samed looks a bit sharper. I don't think he's someone who's going to start in the playoffs, but I think he's someone who could potentially play a part. So while I understand the policy generally, I think we have reached a point now where I think there's probably a little bit of a dearth of confidence in terms of the attack and play in the team. And I think also we've lost a lot of energy and positivity, understandably, because it's been a really tough watch for fans over the last few weeks. It's been really, really difficult if you're someone who's been to pretty much, you know, all of the games out since the international break, and there'll be plenty of people out there in that category. It's been a really, really tough watch, and I think everything coming away from the stadium like yesterday, it felt really, really flat, and that's something that needs to change over the next couple of weeks. And it was interesting speaking to Le Bris after the game in his post-match press conference. He made clear that, you know, the rotation policy is very much at an end now. Sunderland have got 2 games left. There's a week between them. There's a 5-day build up to the Oxford game on Saturday. And he was very clear that we're going to see something much more familiar on Saturday, and hopefully Sunderland can start to build that attacking rhythm and get a little bit of positive energy going, because there's no two ways about it really. The performances of late have been quite tough to watch, and especially in terms of the end product, even if there are some understandable reasons for that. So yeah, that was my thoughts on the game. Let's have a look at some of your questions and comments and see what you're all saying. The one thing that I will say is a lot of you, particularly on YouTube, are mentioning is that rest and rotation is no excuse for the lack of set piece quality, and that is something I completely agree with. I so hope that's something that improves the playoffs, because the number of corners, free kicks, situations where someone had the opportunity to apply some pressure yesterday and just couldn't get past the first sort of man on the front post was really, really frustrating. And I completely agree with you. I think something needs to be much better than that. It's a definite area to address before we go into the playoffs. So Safa Mackham says, do we need to play our starting 11 for the playoffs in the next 2 games in order to build some momentum? Yeah, as I've said there, I definitely think that's the case. I definitely think that's what Sunderland need to do now. I can understand why there's been some rest and rotation over the last few games, but I think now it's time to get some energy going. I think you really need to, some of the players you protected, you need to get them building up a little bit of a head of steam now. I think Enzo Lefebvre is one of those where he's looked bright when he's played. He's had 1 start. I think he needs a couple of games now to get used to the players around him, build some familiarity, build some rhythm, build his match fitness. Yeah, I think we just need to get some positive energy going. I think the forward players need a little bit of confidence. And I think that's really important now that Sunderland really focus on putting out a strong team for those 2 games, trying to get 3 points and sort of moving into the playoffs with a little bit of a feel-good factor if we can get that back, because it has been a good season. To that note, Colin says, regardless what happens in the playoffs, this season's been a massive improvement on last year. We should unequivocally support RLB and the team through at least the first few months of next season and hopefully far beyond. Has been a massive improvement on last year. You know, we all remember that around this time last year, Sunderland played Blackburn. I think that was an Easter weekend game as well with their strongest team, and were beaten emphatically. Sunderland should never have been in that mess. You know, the squad was a lot better than where it finished last year, and if it was very much decisions taken above first team level, I think, in terms of the club hierarchy, in terms of the head coach's decisions they made in the January window and what have you, that meant that Sunderland finished well below what they were capable of last year. But it has been an excellent season, and I do agree with that comment. John says it would feel fitting if you do this video with Every Day is Like Sunday by Morrissey playing in the background. I have thought about musical accompaniments around the whistle. Maybe that's something to think about for next season. But yeah, I totally get it. Feels a little bit tough going for supporters at the moment. Michael says, I felt like we played some nice stuff for spells, but we lacked a little bit of cutting edge from some young players looking to make a statement. I really like the look of Harrison Jones and could see him getting more minutes next season, if not a productive loan. How does the club rate him? Yeah, I agree with Michael in terms of cutting edge is definitely the issue at the moment, and I agree that I thought Harrison Jones had a really good game yesterday. As I said, I thought he looked a little bit tentative in that Swansea game, and I was hopeful that if he got another opportunity, because I've seen him a fair bit in the under-21s. He's a player who's got a goal in him. He's definitely got a player who's got that killer pass in him as well. I think you could see it a lot more yesterday. So that was definitely encouraging. I think that he's done really, I think to some extent he's overachieved this season in terms of he's had the opportunity to train with the first team, because it's been quite a small squad this season. We know there've been a lot of injuries. That's opened up opportunities for him to get on the bench as well. And I think he's just really made the most of that in terms of he's made a big impression on his teammates, certainly on the coaching staff, in terms of the way he's adapted, the way he's taken it on, the way he's trained. And I know certainly there's a feeling that over the last few weeks, last couple of months, he's got a lot more comfortable and a lot more confident in terms of first team training. So I think that he's got a good, really good opportunity. I still think probably next season the best bet is a loan for him. Might depend a little bit on what happens with Sunderland. I think if Sunderland were to get promoted, touch wood, fingers crossed, I think jumping to that level would be really difficult. So I think in that sense, he certainly would be looking at a loan. I think that if Sunderland were to be in the Championship next season, I think it'll be in a category of a few players where he'll be coming back to start pre-season, training with the first team every day. And it'll probably just depend on how he performs and what happens with other players in their squad. There might be some midfield vacancies next season. At the moment, I think he's probably not probably wouldn't be looked at as someone who could start regularly in the Championship. But I think when you see the progress that he's made recently, I don't see there's any reason why he can't make that jump if he kicks on again in pre-season. I think Nectar Triantis is probably in a similar situation. He's had an excellent loan at Hibs. I think Sunderland will definitely be looking to give him the opportunity to bring him in for pre-season, to train with the first team, and for him to really stake a claim for a place. So let's see how that one develops. So Andy on YouTube was talking about where the goals are coming from, even in this team when it's full strength. And Tom here says, the worry is the lack of creativity coupled with poor decision making from midfield to the final third. We don't play through the middle and no one wants to shoot without taking 1 or 2 extra touches. Set pieces that are so important are lacking imagination, need width too. So yeah, I think this is just generally around the theme of Sunderland's attacking struggles. And this is probably my main concern. I'm going to bring another comment here, which is kind of similar, which is Michael saying, getting a bit tired of hearing we can't flick a switch and turn it on for the playoffs. Personally, I get why people say it, but if the players can't find that extra percentage, regardless of cohesion and momentum, then should any of them be playing games of that magnitude? So I agree with Michael in the sense that I do think that I do expect to see a natural improvement when Sunderland get the playoffs and we start seeing a more familiar team. I think that we'll see, I do think the players can quickly recapture a pretty good level. It's not something I'm overly concerned about. I think if you look at the example of Southampton last season, I know they had a better season than Sunderland in terms of their points and they had a stronger squad, but they rotated heavily at the end of the season. And then for the final day of the season, went back to a strong team, won, and then went into the playoffs. I think it is something that you can do. My broader concern a little bit with Sunderland going in those playoffs is, as those Andy as mentioned there and Tom, is that I think the attacking play is a little bit of a concern. I think some of it is personnel. I think Romain Mundle's obviously a big miss. It's such a big goal threat in the first half of the season before he got that injury. I also think fullback is an issue at the moment. And I say that, and I thought that Alan Brown and Joe Anderson did well yesterday, sort of players operating out of position. As I said, Joe Anderson's a centre-half really with minimal Championship experience. Alan Brown in midfielder, I thought both did a good job. I think Brown, I've got no issues with him playing right back generally. But I think that, especially when you're playing against a low block, which is obviously a big issue for Sunderland at the moment, I think your fullbacks are really important because they get so many touches of the ball and they're often the players who have the most space on the pitch. And I think that the lack of natural fullbacks in terms of that attacking threat has been a little bit of an issue for Sunderland over recent weeks. Naturally, when Trey Hume is back from suspension, that'll help. But I think on the other flank, I think Dennis Serkin's really, really important in terms of getting him back and hopefully in good form for the playoffs. Again, it's no slight really on anyone who's played left back in the last few weeks, but I think those players are ones who prefer to their naturally centre halves. And sort of I put Leo Hjelde in with Joe Anderson as well. They're naturally sort of more defensive players because they're centre halves by trade. They're not comfortable, I don't think, overlapping the winger, hitting the byline, putting crosses in, or even driving in field towards the box. I think that's where Serkin is a huge miss, and it's something that Adji Elise does very well when he plays well. So yeah, I agree with you, Michael, in terms of that. I do think you can recover your sort of momentum, if you like, your rhythm. I think a lot of these players have played so many minutes together this season that they will find that cohesion again when they're back together. And especially because they've now got 2 games where most of them are going to be playing together. But I have a little bit of a worry about Sunderland's attacking play. I mentioned Easter's lack of confidence there. That is something that I'm really hoping to see over the next couple of games. Because I don't think there's any doubt that as an attacking unit, Sunderland haven't looked particularly convincing for quite a while now. And that would probably be my primary concern going into those playoffs. Some of that I think will naturally improve when players come back. Some of that I do think is quite dependent on how many players Phil Le Bris is able to. Phil, thank God I'm not the Sunderland manager. How many players Le Bris is able to get back from injury. So to that note, Chris has asked for an injury update on some of the players still sidelined: Dennis Serkin, Dan Ballard, Jensen Seelt, Niall Huggins, Romain Mundle. So we asked about these injuries yesterday after the press conference. So the latest is that Dennis Serkin, touch and go I think for Saturday, but should definitely be back for the QPR game if not. So he should be able to get some minutes before the end of the season. Dan Ballard, Sunderland are also hopeful that he'll be back for the QPR game. So that hopefully means that he'll be able to get some minutes under his belt before the end of the season, which would mean he's fit for the playoffs. Mundle we won't see in the regular season, but should be back to play some part in the playoff semi-finals. Jensen Seelt, not quite sure really in terms of Le Bris has been confident that he could be around the squad for the playoffs, but I think he's had a little bit of a reaction, I think, with that knee. after the commentary game. I don't think there's a major concern, and Le Bris has said he'll be available for the playoffs, but I think we might have to be fairly realistic about how likely he is to get minutes. Now, Huggins is exactly the same. He's been back in non-contact training, which is obviously a real positive. He's really stepping up his recovery. There's a chance he could be back in full training sort of around the group by the time the playoffs come around. But how many minutes he'll be able to play with his match fitness is obviously a completely different question. So hopefully Serkin and Ballard will be able to play a fairly big part in the playoffs. Mundell at the moment, I think it's too early to tell if he'll be ready to start a playoff semi-final, certainly a first leg, but he should be back around the group. Similar with Sealed and Adji Elise, we're just waiting to see whether he is going to be back in time. Le Bris obviously mentioned a while ago that he was increasingly hopeful that he might be able to play some part in the playoffs, even if it's off the bench. We're just waiting to see how those last stages of recovery go, really. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag, really. I think Sunderland will have a lot of players back by the time the playoffs come round. The question is what level of match sharpness and what level of match fitness they have, and how realistic it is they'll be able to go straight into the team. So that's something that we'll have to kind of wait and see and keep an eye on over the coming days, weeks. But there's clearly some positive signs there. And I have a question on Blue Sky here, which from Disjointed47, who says, how does RLB fit Rig and Lefay into the same team? I think it's a really good question. I was probably of the mind going into it that probably the way to do it would be to kind of rotate a little bit. I like the idea of Rig being a little bit of an impact sub for the playoffs. I think he could have a really good impact. I think you saw that yesterday. I think a lot of it might depend on Mundell, because I think there's going to be a really difficult decision for Le Bris if Mundell isn't ready to start the playoff semi-finals, and he's certainly not going to be ready for the next 2 games. Is there a debate to be had about the thing to do is to get your best 11 players on the pitch, and in that sense you put Lefay on the left again? It's not something I want to see him do in terms of I really want to see Lefay play in the middle. I think he could have a big impact there. But I suppose you know that you've got Neil, Job and Rig as a really sort of convincing trio who've played a lot of football together. Lefay was really effective when he played on the left when he first came to the team. So I wonder if that's a bit of an answer to that question. I wonder if that's a potential option until you're in a position where Mundell can start. And then once Mundell can start, maybe Lefay and Rig are kind of sharing minutes, or those 4 midfielders are sharing the minutes. But yeah, really interesting one to see how that goes. And the last question here from Ian. So Ian asked about whether he thinks Le Bris goes full strength for the last 2 games. Hopefully I've answered that early in the video. And then Ian says, I've been very critical of Tommy Watson, questions mentality, but today was better. Looked bright and did carry a threat at times. End product and some decision making was poor. How did you see him this week? I thought he was much better yesterday. Some of his decision making wasn't quite right, but I also thought the movement in the box wasn't very good. I did think he put some really dangerous balls in, like low balls, where you're really hoping that you've got 3 or 4 players sort of attacking the 6-yard box to try and get on the end of it, and that just didn't really happen. I thought that was a big problem yesterday. I thought his intensity was much better, his body language was better, and I think you could see that the fans sort of responded to that. Completely appreciate and understand that, a lot of fans are really disappointed Watson's going to Brighton and would rather he's not involved in the team. Le Bris wants to be pragmatic about this because, especially with Mundell injured, he feels that Watson can have a part to play, even if it is off the bench in the playoffs. I think yesterday was a big game because Sunderland really backed Watson, didn't they? Le Bris coming out before the game and asking for fans to get behind Watson. It was really important that Watson repaid that really and delivered a performance. And while it was, it wasn't a Spartan performance, I did think it was a step in the right direction. Hopefully Watson can go away from that sort of understanding really the base level of application and intensity that he needs to bring to games. And I think the fact that, yes, there was some boos when he got substituted off, but I think there was mostly applause. And I think that probably tells you that it was a tentative step in the right direction. So, yeah, there we go. I think I've answered most of your questions. Hopefully, hopefully you've enjoyed watching the video. Thanks for sticking with me. I'm really hopeful that we'll have a couple of better performances to talk about before we get to those playoffs, because I appreciate it's quite hard going at the moment. But yeah, thanks for sticking with me. Thanks for getting all your questions and comments in as ever. Thanks for watching.